Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, a podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Elijah Fleming.
I'm Colin McCormick.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we are following our El Corazon, that's our heart, and we are discussing Romancing the Stone, an 1984 romantic comedy.
1894.
I know, right? In 1894. This
Queen
feels
Victoria
kinda
is all the rage.
movie, yeah. A romantic comedy adventure film directed by Robert Zemeckis, written by Diane Thomas, and produced by Michael Douglas, who also stars alongside Kathleen Turner and for some reason Danny DeVito.
You take that
Because they were
back.
roommates.
They were roommates.
Yeah.
And here to help us navigate our way through this jungle is Raven Todd DaSilva, an award-winning scholar, archaeologist, and art conservator. She's also the creator of the online platform and YouTube channel Dig It with Raven, which is dedicated to making the ancient past accessible to everyone. Raven also recently released a book titled The Other Ancient Civilizations, Decoding Archaeology's Less Celebrated Cultures. Welcome to the show, Raven.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
So yeah, we always start with our guest. So what is your kind of history with the film Romancing the Stone, and do you dig it?
Oh, man. So I think I first saw this film in my early 20s, and I had this weird obsession with Michael Douglas afterwards. So I definitely
This is going to feed
dug
into
it
one of my first
on.
questions.
Yeah. I don't know what it was. I think it was like after that dancing scene, and then they like just you know how it is. But then watching it back, I was like, oh, what were my standards like in my early 20s? Just
The same could be said for America in the 80s.
True.
yeah.
Which did have a big
So-
obsession with Michael Douglas, and the 90s as well.
He had really great hair.
He did.
I am very jealous of the hair, but I do dig the film. It's fun. It's exciting. I love Danny DeVito in it, and it's just a really great little trio they have.
All right, Colin, I want to hear your thoughts.
I have a bunch of questions that I wrote out for the rest of you, mostly as like, well, I'll get to that in a second. Because I have a whole slew of questions, but broadly, yes, I dig this movie. It's fun. As I was watching it, I was wondering, like, what are we actually going to talk about? Because there actually isn't really that much archaeology per se in this film. But then I came around and I'm like, at the same time, as a film, I think it's important to sort of for us to consider to triangulate with Indiana Jones, and then looking ahead to maybe even like Laura Croft. And then further down the line, I want to ask Christy what she thought about it vis-a-vis The Lost City, because this is kind of like the text for that movie. And I know Christy really liked that one. But all in all, it's an interesting vehicle for Michael Douglas. Can you guys hear my cat? Is he free?
I just saw
He
him
left
like
the
fly
room.
by.
But yeah, I dig it. I think it's a fun movie. It's to me like peak VHS. Like this is a movie that screams. You would watch this, you would have this on VHS, and the box would be like falling apart and fraying at the corners, and I can like see it already. This is like the peak VHS movie.
Yeah. Colin, had you had seen it before because you had talked about it when we discussed The Lost City.
Yeah, but years. Where's the fire, dude? Just had to turn around and go look out this window. Yeah, I was familiar with this one, and this is because this is another case, I think, for Christy, of you kind of seeing the movies in reverse order, like seeing Lost City first, going back and seeing this one as like this is very much laying a lot of that groundwork. So I'm just going to ask you, like, what was it? What was that like?
Yeah, so I watched it for the first time last night. Had never heard of it because, as we've more or less established, I just don't watch films that came out before I was born, apparently. So like I'm missing out on a lot. And so last night was the first time I watched it. And in terms of like if I dig it, this movie felt weird in terms of like this movie of 1980s NYC felt alien in a way that like films set in the ancient world don't for some reason, because it's like uncanny valley. Like here's, payphones and traveler's checks. And it's like, I remember that stuff from my childhood, but it seems so drastically different from today's world that it feels unreal. And I think the other unreal part of it all was the fact that this was a romance happening, because I'm like, there is nothing romantic at all happening here. With the exception, Raven, I'm glad you brought up the dance scene, because I was watching this on Prime, which is not great, except that it always shows you the trivia and stuff, like,
Mhm.
as the show is playing.
Mhm.
So it mentioned that, Douglas he was just messing around dancing, and Zemeckis was filming him without his knowledge.
Yeah, that's all
S
stolen footage of them like
Yeah.
chatting.
Really?
Which is
Yeah.
part of why the sound mixing is so weird in that scene.
I
Yeah.
did not know that. That's
Which,
wild.
if you look at The Lost City, because like, that's a big moment in that movie
Uh-huh.
too, of the actual romance happening between, Channing Tatum and Sandra Bullock. And Channing Tatum was also a dancer, so it was kind of funny that that was, like, the one organic moment kind of shown between the 2 characters that had chemistry, and, like, that's kind of where most of the romance was in the moment.
The dancing wasn't even that good.
No, it was
Again, like,
just
watching it again as, like, my frontal lobe being fully developed, I was like,
Yeah.
"What is this? Is not romance." Like,
yeah,
I would
yeah.
not be inclined to do anything with Michael Douglas after that dancing.
Uh, so, like, all of that is, like, I don't and yeah, as we'll talk about, there's, like, even less archaeology in this than we've seen in, like, I don't know, Stargate or something. It's more of like, is this archaeology, or is this just we dug in the dirt for a few minutes and called it a day? All of that being said, Joan Wilder's character, I absolutely love. She was so fun. She was awesome, and, I'm sure we'll go into more of why that's the case. So, I came out of it loving her as a character,
Mhm.
and all of the shenanigans around her just made me fall in love with her, basically. So, that's where I'm at on it.
Nice.
Daj, what about you?
Yeah, I knew that this movie existed, but I had never seen it before this week. So I also watched Lost City and then this in reverse. And but Nick had seen it and he was like, "Haven't you seen Romancing the Stone? It's like Lost City. It's exactly the same thing. It's a romance novelist and they go to the jungle." And and so he watched it with me and I was like, "Yeah, I see where that's coming from and like I see those connections, but they end up very differently."
Mhm.
And I think I also really love Kathleen Turner in this. She's so much fun and she like is such a capable heroine for like also being what in the world am I doing? Like she really seems to actually get shit done and like
Mhm.
saves herself, which I
Yes.
think is a fun point of this movie that you kind of don't need some random dude that you found in the jungle to like rescue you from from those snappers, which I know
Look
we'll
at them
talk about. We'll
snappers.
talk about those snappers. I think I did really dig this movie, but watching it as an adult, I don't want Michael Douglas in this movie. I want a different person.
Well,
I feel like this could have been an interesting character if he was more charismatic or just like maybe played this differently. And maybe that's a controversial take,
I,
but
I
that's
was
my take.
wondering how, like, is this movie how it would play if it was like Kurt Russell in the lead or something like that?
Yeah.
Well, and they tried to get a bunch of different people, because Christopher Reeves, Sylvester Stallone,
Stallone
uh
would be weird.
That would be weird.
yeah, but, I think, shoot, who's the other? Burt Reynolds, I think, was
Oh, Burt Reynolds would also be kind of, how old would he have never?
that doesn't
But
matter.
well, because Michael Douglas ended up outbidding them because he was like, this is like in the arc of his career, this is kind of, he hasn't quite reached his like what he's going to eventually be known for being like sleazy, like someone once described it to me as like America's id in like the late 80s and early 90s. Like he's got this like, he's like he's always like an adulterer and a drug addict and like a Wall Street felon or something like that. He's always some kind of like grimy sleazebag in these like erotic thrillers. And you can see like there's like an undercurrent, like he's still a little more,
Oh, that's very present in this movie.
yeah, like he's kind of a little bit more like conventionally leading man, but not really. Like he has that like harder edge to him.
Yeah,
Wild.
I
Should I do a quick plot? Should we do a quick plot
yes,
rundown?
Yeah,
yeah, run
there's
down the
not
plot.
really much to this plot, but yeah.
No.
Nothing.
So
Don't even
yeah,
open the
our
map.
Right?
We
Okay,
don't
so
get to
one of
see
my
the map.
problems that we'll get to is what is this map? Like, who made it? Where did it come
Yeah.
from? Why do we have it?
Did I miss some? What is El Corazon? Is other than, I mean, obviously it's an
It's
enormous emerald,
it's
but
the heart in Spanish, and that's all we
That's
can
literally
say.
it.
yeah,
I actually like looked up to see if Disney, because I watched it on Disney Plus, if they had edited the film and taken
Mhm.
out scenes but put it on streaming, because I was like, I swear there was more to this, like more context, but clearly not.
Yeah. Yeah. So our plot starts with our romance novelist, Joan Wilder, and she kind of has to come out of her shell, venture beyond her little comfort zone to Colombia to save her sister, whose husband has just been chopped into little bits, and is now being like held ransom for a map that before her husband got chopped into little bits, her sister sent to Joan.
Well, no, Eduardo sent it to
Eduardo
her.
sent it before he
yeah.
was chopped into little bits.
And everyone is real kind of blasé about that. Like, oh yeah,
Right?
your sister's husband was like murdered and dissected. Like,
Oh my
you know, it
Yeah,
happens.
the editor friend is just like, "How's your sister doing?" She's okay. She's like, "Oh, she'll bounce back. That's just the way she."
No.
Yeah, like okay. So Joan very quickly becomes lost in the jungle, being sort of waylaid by head of secret police, head of normal police.
Secret police. They
There's
say
one point
secret police.
they list off his, yeah, he's like a general, but also like the head cop, but also like the cultural like antiquities head guy. Like he
Yeah.
seems like he kind of like is maybe running the country or something.
Or something. Yeah, I don't know. But that's our buddy Zolo or Solo. I keep wanting to say Zolo because it's a Z.
Mhm.
And then she's also being tracked down by Danny DeVito, who is part of the kidnappers who have her sister. And I'm sorry, I could not take Danny DeVito seriously in this movie.
Are you
And
I
supposed to
mean,
take him seriously
I
at any
don't
point in his
know.
career?
he's pure comedy, right?
Yeah.
For the like.
I feel like Philoctetes in Disney's Hercules is his most serious role.
Well, no, I was going to say there's a whole
Okay.
Danny DeVito has a whole second career as a very serious dramatic director and also off Broadway. Like he has like, you know,
Okay.
there's the Danny DeVito that we know as children of like Phil and Matilda and that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And there is a whole other side of Danny DeVito as a very serious dramatic actor who's
Fair enough.
and director as well. But
Fair
this
enough.
is
But
like,
that was not this.
No.
well,
That
yeah,
was
this
not
is his
this.
launch pad because after he had only done a few movies before, or a few things before this, like he was in Taxi and
Sure.
one other thing. But this is like America will go in on Danny DeVito for the next 40 years.
So I feel like Danny DeVito didn't have to be in this movie and everything would have happened the same. And I don't know, it felt like such a departure in the type of humor.
Mhm.
And is that just me? Like, how do you guys feel? We're just like all in on Danny DeVito.
Yeah, it's so this also goes to the original screenplay because I do want to talk about Diane Thomas, who wrote
Yeah.
the screenplay, because
Mhm.
her story is really interesting too. But part of the reason that Zemeckis picked it up was that he said like it was kind of raw and spontaneous, and I'm like that definitely comes across in the plot of there's just so much going on that you do have two sets of like people interested in stealing the map, but you also have the guy who is a drug dealer, loves Joan Wilder's books, and has Pepe,
Oh
the Ford
God, yeah.
Bronco.
I completely even forgot about random guy in the middle of the jungle who loves her romance books.
The entire town listens to him read them on Saturdays, and I'm like, "Okay, that's endearing."
So
Yeah,
wholesome.
spectacular.
Um, and so, like, some of the spontaneity was, like, what attracted the people to the project, but at the same time, they also thought it was gonna be a huge flop, and this
Mhm.
movie was actually successful enough that it gets a sequel, A Jewel of the
Yeah.
Nile
Jewel of
or
the
something.
Nile.
Yeah.
Yeah, which doesn't have any like Zemeckis isn't on board. Diane Thomas isn't
Didn't
around to
write,
write the
yeah.
ski. So by all my most metrics, I haven't seen Jewel of the Nile, but as I understand it, it is a significant downgrade from this one.
It's
Yeah.
not as good.
So maybe that was something that people liked at the time, like, this was so different and but entertaining, and you had a lot of fresh faces that maybe that made it fun. That's kind
Mm.
of that's been a discussion in media lately is that like all of these projects are like do or die of like films. Like they're big budget films with the expectation that you're going to get even more money back, that you can't really get these lower budget films that could do surprisingly well because they're just entertaining. They don't have
Mm,
necessarily to have substance to be enjoyed by the masses. So I think that's
sure.
where this film falls, is like there's no context for any of the
No.
archaeology or whatever they're doing at all. But like we still found it fun to watch as a
Yeah, no,
result.
you're right. Yeah. Okay, well, speaking of substance, like, then we I don't even know where I was really going with that. I was trying to get to the plane filled with marijuana, but I don't think there's a
Weren't
way
we
to
all?
get
Emphasis on substance.
yeah, I don't know how I was gonna get there. But Joan, in her adventure, teams up with exotic bird wrangler,
Mhm.
Jack Colton, who is trying to buy a boat and wants $375 from her in traveler's checks to get her to a phone. They end up, of course, going like following the map and going after El Corazon, and like insanity ensues.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For lack of a better word, yeah.
Yeah.
That is my summation of the plot.
So I want to go back to the connection of like there's so many beats in this movie that you see in The Lost City that The Lost City improved immensely on. And
I would agree with that.
Mhm.
I think one of the biggest ones was the fact that like, and I think it still makes The Lost City one of the best archaeology films we've ever talked about. Because when we've talked about, you know, Indiana Jones and Lara Croft, those movies are more about the culture of archaeologists than the discipline of archaeology. Like, there's no concern about, like, who are the people of the past that we are taking their stuff or actually legitimately digging their stuff. Versus, like, Sandra Bullock comes in and she's interpreting the wall art, and we get multiple interpretations of what the crown of fire could be. And it's
Mhm.
like, okay, that's actual archaeology, and what archaeologists do in the field is they look at these objects and then they create stories about the people, right?
Mhm.
And so this was how I was going to tie in. Raven did this as well in her book of the other ancient civilizations. Of you open each chapter with a little almost novella about someone who lived in these ancient civilizations and what, you know, a little day or a moment in their life might have looked like. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to include that in your book and why you think it's actually important when telling archaeology stories?
It's so cute that you noticed that.
Mhm.
I they were honestly my favorite parts of the book to write. I wanted to do it to sort of bring the reader immediately into the world that they were about to enter with the academic part of the book. So like that's the beginning of the chapter. I just want you to like have that immersive storytelling so that way you're able to just kind of get your, see through the eyes of someone, walk a mile in the shoes type vibe of just going, okay, like where would I be? So you don't actually just see it as this, 3,000 words of listing facts. It's these were real people. They lived, very different lives maybe to what we do, but they also had very similar activities, feelings, wants, needs. And we can see that through the archaeological record just from very simple objects. So I always made sure that the story was either completely based off of like a person that we have a record for, or
Mhm.
just one particular object that just kind of grabbed my attention. So whenever I was doing research, I'd sort of just look and say like, what was that one thing for me that sort of helped me connect to that culture when I was researching them. And then you sort of have to then I like just made a story about it and just saying like, well, how would that be used and where would that setting have come from? And, it could be completely wrong, but it was something that, based off of what we have within the context, that it could actually have been used in that particular way. And it just really humanizes the past for us and gets us to appreciate it a lot more.
Yeah. I loved that, absolutely loved that part of your book. I was so happy to see it because I tried to do something very similar in my dissertation because so Elijah and I met and Doug at Ganjavecchio, and we were finding medical tools and objects of female fertility, as well as a stamped lamp with a childbirth scene. And so I'm just like, all right, I'm gonna imagine a female doctor working in this space. And I wrote out like a little novella of like what would a day in the life of a medica at the site look like. And unfortunately, one of my people on my committee didn't want me to include it in my dissertation, so it got pulled out.
No.
But similarly, it was my favorite part to write. Like, if you know how much of a drag a dissertation can be to write, like years and years of just writing factual information down and interpreting theory and things like that, to all of a sudden just be like, what does this actually mean to me? Who are these people and what did their lives look like? Why do I care about this site from 2000 years ago?
Mhm.
Exactly.
It's because I care about the stories of the past, and, so I thought that was so cool to see in your book, and I think what is the most frustrating part about this movie is, like, there is nothing about we don't even know how Eduardo
Not
got
a
there
thing.
and who
How
he
old is
was.
the map? Where's the
Yeah,
map
Right?
from?
yeah.
Well, how did it end up?
Why
'Cause when they discover the heart, it's inside like a porcelain
rabbit?
Rabbit.
right? From like maybe a year ago. Like, did Eduardo hide the like? Who put it in that? Like, is this a modern thing? Was this mined like in the last 5 years? Is it an ancient thing?
Yeah.
We don't know. We know nothing about
There's
that.
nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it looks like an emerald or it's a green stone. So, is that, like, from the old world? Did the conquistadors bring it over because the map's completely in Spanish? Or is it, like, something they stole from indigenous cultures nearby and they hid it? Because I don't know, like, that's just it's so
I think
frustrating.
we're trying too hard with it. They were just like, we're
You
gonna just get
know?
this big green
Yeah,
rock and put some lights in it to make it glow, and that's gonna be
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
treasure.
because like the genre, I guess, like the genre exercise of this movie is maybe like this isn't, I guess, a quote unquote adventure archaeology film of a. I don't know if that genre is really a thing yet because we really just have Indiana Jones
Yeah.
prior to this, but because the genre that we're really in is romance, right? Where
Mhm.
Sure.
I feel like that's the operating sort of mindset or like the governing principle is like we are in a romance novel or like a subversion of a romance novel because the whole point
Mhm.
of the story is that this adventure is simultaneously like and also dislike how Joan imagines her own stories.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because the opening sequence, again, very, like, beat for beat following Lost City or Lost City following it is like it's this her story playing out, right? Like the one she's
Mhm.
currently working on, and it's a Western.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I'm and versus when we get to the Lost City almost 40 years later, the opening scene is we're in a lost tomb in the jungle surrounded by snakes.
How did they get
And
there?
yeah, and she's writing that, and, like, I thought that was kind of a cool, like, yeah, this shift of what has been Hollywood's adventure setting. For a
Sure.
long time, it was the Western,
Mhm.
and now it's very much it is archaeology-esque, but it's kind of this idea of traveling to foreign spaces that are dangerous, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of Columbia anxiety in this film, which feels very
Mhm.
Very much
80s,
so.
right?
Yeah.
Because we're
Well, and
right in the like.
apparently it was supposed to be shot in Colombia, but they moved it to Veracruz, Mexico because, too many kidnappings of Americans were happening at the time in Colombia, so
Which also I want to mention the that her sister gets kidnapped by like a 9-year old who takes her out like like the sort of
The
anxiety
little
of this
bolo.
of the yeah
Right?
exactly like Colombia is so dangerous that like even the street children will like abduct you and hijack your car.
like, professionally, like, that was
Yeah,
a that
yeah,
was
that
an
kid was like an
amazing thing.
assassin.
I know. So in that it is still very different from Indiana Jones. I feel like it's still trying to operate in some of that space,
Mhm,
especially since Raiders had like just come out with like all of the jungle trekking and that mudslide that they
mhm.
go down and just like searching for something. I think like whatever the something might be. And so I kept trying to like see like weird Indiana Jones just like weird thematic little elements, like trying to get across the bridge.
Mhm.
And I kept expecting there to be some crazy bug that comes out or something, but we got the snake.
Yeah, you
Did
get
get
the
the
That
snake.
she's
snake.
the snake.
I thought that was
Um,
actually very cleverly done. I mean, I hate violence against snakes because I think snakes are kinda cute, but,
yeah.
like, you chop off its head and just slowly keep pulling it
Mhm.
to show just how
That's how
giant it was.
giant it was.
Mhm.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's this like the history itself is the thing that's missing from this that we do have in Indiana Jones. So is this, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like how to even compare this to Indiana Jones.
Well, I have a thought that I was going to ask, and particularly I wanted to ask the three of you because I wanted to talk about like the female gaze, such as it is in this movie, because that to me is the biggest point of departure from Indiana Jones, where this is, and Chrissy kind of alluded it to, the screenwriter Diane Thomas. It was written by a woman, and one of the
Mhm.
things we liked so much about Lost City is that there's an emphasis on like that different perspective that Sandra Bullock's character notices things, interprets the Crown of Fire differently from Daniel Radcliffe, like has
Mhm.
this sort of alternative way into this material. And I think like this movie to me, like it's kind of priming that pump a little bit. There's still points where like I think Zemeckis gets a little leery with the camera, but like
Yes.
there is definitely like I wanted to ask about this as like, is this a woman's film? Do you feel like a sort of like this was told from a woman's perspective and like conceived in that way? Whereas Indiana Jones is a very like male centric fantasy.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I wanted to add just because some people did knock this film thinking like they had been copying Raiders, but actually the screenplay was written a few years before Raiders came out. So in
Mhm.
terms of the storyline itself, it is original. It's outside the influence of the Indiana Jones films. That doesn't necessarily mean the shooting of it though,
Yeah.
and some of
Right.
the
And
Yeah.
Like you can do like Zemeckis is closely tied in with Spielberg, and he's
Mhm.
buddies with him and Lucas. But I mean, so Diane Thomas is this kind of classic kind of Hollywood story. She was supposedly like a waitress when she wrote the screenplay, and then it got out, and then everybody was bidding for it, and Michael Douglas ended up bidding the most, and then
Mhm.
she died very tragically, very young, basically like a year after this came out, and so this is her only credited screenplay. She'd written a third Indiana Jones that
She
never
did.
saw the light of day.
Which was
Ugh,
apparently Indiana Jones going to a haunted house, and I'm like,
Yeah,
"I don't know what that would look like,
I need
and I
that.
but
regret
I
that we
want
don't have
to
it."
see it.
sounds kind of fun.
I
Yeah.
think it would be fun. It's like, where's this haunted house? Like, why not? Let's do it.
It's just full of snakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the other part about her story, because her mother came out and commented, like, they really framed it as a Cinderella story, and Thomas was really frustrated with that because she'd actually been studying acting for years. Like, she was trying to break her way in the industry. It wasn't like "Oh, I'm just a waitress writing this amazing story on the side, and, oh, look, it got picked up." She's like, no, that was what she'd been working towards, like, for her entire life. And, yeah, she died in a car accident. Her and her boyfriend and a friend were coming back home from Pepperdine after classes. They went out and got some drinks, and her boyfriend was driving a Porsche that just got wrapped around a tree.
Jesus.
And that car had actually been gifted to Thomas by Douglas, as a thank you for her work on the
Whoa.
film. So, yeah, it's kind of a crazy life story that she had, and I think it's really sad because it would've been really cool to see what else she would have come up with, how she might have
Definitely.
influenced this genre of I don't know, I feel like the '80s is where a lot of these start building up in terms of, like, you get more of the traditional Indiana Jones archaeology. You get what I call more of, like, the treasure hunter
Mhm.
kind of concept, that I don't know, maybe we see more with, like, National Treasure or something like that. And then you've got this I would say, like, the found lost civilizations, which is kind of what Stargate is, where it's like, "Oh, no, we actually find the people who are still living, like, in the ancient past." And that seems to be
Right.
where a lot of our archaeology genres tend to fall, is kind of into those 3 fields. And this one, it's interesting, and I think the hard part is, like, I think this was supposed to be about romance, but also adventure. And the fact that like it looks so much like Indiana Jones because it's acknowledging the fact that women love adventure too.
Sure.
Like
Okay.
her getting to pick up the machete. She's like, "Can I try that?" And
Yeah.
he's like, "Yeah, here you go." And she's like, "I too would be terrified to hold a machete and swing it around." But it's like, "But I'd want to try it out and see how that goes." And the runaway scene in the Bronco with Pepe and jumping over the river, I'm like, that actually looks legitimately fun to be in that vehicle. So it's interesting that like the adventure aspect, right, is really what is exciting, and that is brought out by travel. And what does it mean to travel and kind of find yourself in an unfamiliar space where you can't necessarily communicate with people around you. You are in an unfamiliar environment, you don't know the dangers. The romance, I think this is like what feels so alien about this is because the romance, there's still Zemeckis is incorporating the male gaze visually, very
Mhm.
awkwardly so, with, like, Douglas's head between her legs after the mudslide,
Yeah, that was
and
There's
him
Oh
just
God,
oh my
staring, like,
god.
looking at
that was a
and it's like, "I'm
horrible.
just looking at a leg. I know what you're trying to insinuate, like, ooh, this is sexy." I'm like, "It's a leg. Can we move on, please?"
there's stories of Kathleen Turner kind of getting butting heads with Zemeckis, who wanted
Mhm.
her to like kind of be standing in a certain way because it like looks cool visually. It looks like like a pulp cover or something like that. And
Mhm.
she's like, I can't, like, that is deeply awkward, and I can't act if I'm like striking this awkward pose and things like that. So yeah.
Good
Um,
for her.
Yeah. What about you guys? What's kind of your take on this is contributing something to the genre for sure, at least in film.
I would like to think kind of I've kind of seen it almost as, like fantasy versus romantasy and that sort of
Mhm.
discourse right now, where
mhm,
a lot of these archaeology films are written by men. And then we get Romancing the Stone, which is sort of like that seed that we could have of maybe if it's written by a woman, we can add a little bit more of this romancy side to it. And you have a little bit more fun and like that strong female character where she's sort of taken out of that comfortable zone and she has to learn to do a lot of things and she goes through her whole character arc, right? You see that from the beginning of the film where she keeps getting stopped by those people on the street trying to
Mhm.
hustle
Mhm.
her, and then at the end she's walking confidently down the road ignoring everyone, like, I don't need to talk to you guys. So we see those arcs and she's really gone through a lot of growing in that. And I think it's very similar to the discourse we're seeing now between fantasy and romantasy, where now if you get more women in there, I think it would be really cool to see how we can further develop it and make them even more exciting.
mhm.
Yeah.
I like the little storytelling, like the character development of like her going around and the post-it notes. It's like, buy tissues, buy toilet paper, buy paper towels,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and the way like when she celebrates a drink, she has like a mini bar of like
Her little mini bar.
individual. Yeah, it's
I
like they're
love the
like the
mini bar.
individual like airplane travel size liquor bottles.
Tiny
Um,
little thing.
yeah.
I think she was just living every single woman's dream in the 80s
She
in New York. Like
was.
she had a
Yeah.
great sized apartment
Mhm.
Mhm.
and
Gorgeous.
she could just drink and eat, hang out with her cat the whole time. And she just wrote her fun little romance
Brilliant.
books. Like, who can
Mhm.
ask
Mhm.
for more?
I
Right.
Yeah.
think Turner actually introduced I don't think that was originally in the screenplay, but Turner's like, "I don't think people will be sympathetic enough to my character unless I have a cat." And I'm like, that her the opening scene with her and Romeo
Feel
was just like,
attacked.
"This is the life I want right here so much. Me and my cats and a romantic dinner together."
And all my friends and every stranger and my neighbor being like, when are you gonna get married?
Yeah,
That's very 80s. Yeah.
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 Yes.
Uh, and it doesn't even seem like she's necessarily interested in like
No.
finding a man. Like it's kind of her editor pushing her. It's like, "You live alone with a cat." I'm like, "But it's hot."
Also,
Like
those
I like
men at
that.
that bar were
We're
not
so
exactly.
80s.
None of them were attractive.
No offense to the
No.
actors, but like, woof.
What was the
Yeah,
term?
no.
Mondo Gizmo? Because like
Mondo Dismo.
Mondo Dismo. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what does that mean?
What does that mean? Yeah. Well, no, I think, yeah, she was sitting at the bar, and I feel like that felt very female gazy, right? Of like two women sitting at a bar and just being like, I don't want to talk to any of these guys. Like, can we just like not think about them? And yeah, I like the way that you framed that, Colin, of just like, which kind of vision are we looking for in this? And I do wonder what would have happened if there was a female director in addition to it being written by a woman.
It wouldn't have been Michael Douglas.
It would not have been Michael Douglas.
Well,
And
it kind of had to be Michael Douglas because he's one of the producers and he bought the rights.
Don't care. Don't care.
He's going to be in this film one way or the other.
That's fine. He can be Danny DeVito's cousin. He can be Ira.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the bald cap line that you can see on Ira?
Oh, yeah.
Like the first half of the film. It was not blended in well.
No.
Well, there was like, I mean, speaking of like just that kind of, there's a moment where like the kind of maybe the props or the set designer are cutting corners a little bit. There's a part where Michael Douglas like swings, it's when they're crossing the bridge and he hits the rocks and you can see the rock like squish a little bit. Like it's the rock has a little give.
Yeah, it's like a pillow or styrofoam or something.
Yeah, it's like very clearly like a foam rock that which makes sense, but yeah. So should we talk about Jack?
Yeah. I wanted to add one other side note because I don't know where else to put it. The cutting off of the heels from your high heels to make them walking shoes, that is not feasible. That is how I know a woman was not in charge. Because you can't just take a heel off a high heel and make it walkable.
Well, I guess this is kind of what we're getting at. Is like this movie has sort of three authors that are sometimes at odds with one another, right? There's the Diane Thomas of it, which you very much see, and kind of by extension, Kathleen Turner sort of inhabiting that role. Yeah. There's the Zemeckis thing where you get like the leeriness sometimes of the camera, like in that opening scene or when she's macheting through the jungle. And then there's Michael Douglas, where this is kind of a project for Michael Douglas to set up. This is a deliberate, calculated move on his part to kind of set himself up for his later career. As, thinking about him as like the child of Kirk Douglas, right? A very sort of macho-y, this is Spartacus's son, right? We're looking at, and he'll have a very different career from his dad, probably wisely, and he's going to pivot into a very different kind of male lead. But yeah, so like there's this as a Michael Douglas vehicle, which is really my first question that I have in my notes was Michael Douglas hot or not?
No.
I mean, not. Like great hair.
Yeah, it's not.
But I'm gonna say not.
There were times when I was like, okay, hot. But most of the time,
when his hair is wet and pulled back, like that looked really good. And it's one of those things. It's like hot is something like almost unattainable. The same way like women being hot, for a normal person feels unattainable. Versus Douglas in here. If his personality was someone I could connect with and relate to, yeah, I would find him attractive and would like hanging out and all of that. Like it feels much more of a normal, like could be attracted to this person as opposed to, yeah, there's no way I could end up with, what's his name from Witcher?
Henry Cavill?
Yeah, Henry Cavill, who's like epitome of male hotness in some ways in my mind. As The Witcher, not so much as Superman, but there you go.
I can see, yeah.
I like it's his personality is terrible.
Yeah.
He's capturing exotic birds to sell them, and he's like
obsessed with his sailboat.
He's obsessed with his sailboat, and he's kind of like trying to con her out of the map the entire movie. And then is like going between like trying to get the crocodile that ate El Corazon or like going to help her.
Yeah.
And like, even though he kind of makes the right choice at the end, like he chooses helping her over going after the stone, he doesn't help. No. Like he's incapable.
That's what I liked about that scene is it kind of it had it both ways where it's like he makes the right moral choice to go for her, but then also because I think it says is like you'll be fine, like on your, like she's also fine on her own, she can handle the armless Zolo. And I like the movie was very good. This feels like actually like classic Zemeckis, the way it kept kind of undoing or like sabotaging the plan, right? Like she throws the knife and then he catches the knife, and then
Mhm.
Michael Douglas gets the gun and then he's got the shot lined up, but the gun's out of bullets, and like that kind of stuff. I thought that's just like great sort of narrative tension building.
I also just question his decision to climb the wall, like scale the wall, as opposed to go and find stairs.
It's a flat wall. I don't understand how he even was doing it because there was nothing to grab onto.
No. Yeah, I don't know. But no, I agree that I like that she is able to take care of herself in that situation. But if we're just thinking about like Jack as a character, I just he's not. No, I think he could have not come back at the end with his sailboat, and I would have been fine.
Yeah.
Because Joan is fine, you know?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we have seen her. She's had this growth. She feels so confident. She has a brand new book. Like she's killing it. She doesn't need him to come back.
Mhm.
But it's nice that he does, I guess. So yeah, I still Michael Douglas not hot.
I'm sorry, he comes back having bought the boat with the stone she helped find. And yeah, he fought an alligator for it. But like, hey babe, look what I bought.
Hopefully there's some money left over, you think.
Mostly for me, but you could come with me if you want.
Yeah, right.
But she's independently doing
Yeah,
well.
she could write her books anywhere, frankly. So that's fine. It works for her lifestyle. But like, yeah, I think that's what is the most interesting is that the romance at the end is like both of these individuals could be perfectly happy if they don't end up with each other, which is somewhat refreshing as opposed to like it. And I think that's kind of this is where I wanted to bring it back to like the culture of archaeologists and traveling, because one could argue romance is a huge aspect of it, or it gets talked about as if it is.
Sure.
We've known many of people who have
I don't want to, I mean, I do, but I don't want to ask about like dig romances, dig marriages, dig babies.
yeah, like those are very
I
real things.
I feel like everybody
Yeah.
has to know somebody who either got together on an archaeological dig and then either is now married or is like won't talk to each other.
Or we like shipped on an archaeological dig and they eventually got together.
In our case, that is what happened.
Yeah.
But like I know I've been in the field with multiple people who have married people that they met on an archaeological dig. So I think it is certainly a part of it because it's talk about being in the field as kind of like it's like summer camp on steroids, right? So you're, doing something outside and there's a lot of work involved, but it's also something that if you're there, you're really excited about and you're really like passionate about being in the field. Hopefully, if you get to that point. I think there's always the undergrads who had no idea what they were getting
Yeah.
into. But if you were there with someone that also feels similarly about how cool this is and how lucky we get to, to be on this excavation and look at all these fun stuff that we get to do, plus the summer camp of it all. Yeah, I think it's inevitable that romances come out of that.
Yeah.
What about stones?
Get out.
I think it's also one of those things where you're like, if you're really into this one weird, obscure thing, and then you find someone who is also into this other weird, obscure thing, not just archaeology in general, but just like the one, like a specific type of pottery.
Mhm.
And you can just nerd out over like this like little rim piece. And then you just get everyone's not.
Yeah.
But that's it. Like,
I went to
it's
my
like,
brain
oh,
did a
that's
Michael
so
Scott
hot.
there when you said rim piece.
Yeah. I was
Colin, get out.
Sorry.
like a little like a rim shirt or like something. Like for me it's the plastered skulls from the Neolithic, and like I take people to the museum and I look at it and people think they're so creepy and ugly, and I'm like, they're my babies. And so of course if someone's like, yeah, they're really cool, you're like, that's hot. Like you're taking an interest in my interest and you're actually enjoying it. And that was another issue I had with Michael Douglas's character, because he only all that time he was spending tracking down this crocodile, getting this boat, and coming back to her. He only read one of her books.
Mhm.
And he bragged about it. He's like, I even read one of your books. I'm like, sir, you had so much extra time on this boat.
Yeah.
At least take an interest in her profession and show her that you care about what she does as a strong, independent woman. But no, you're just your silly little job with your silly romance. I read one, haha, the end. Didn't appreciate that. Not hot.
Yeah, that's why The Lost City, again, like, improved upon this because you have at the end Channing Tatum being, like, trying to write a romance scene
Yeah.
and Sandra
Yes,
Bullock makes it's like, "Oh, no, you introduced throbbing way too early."
Yeah, you got to hold
this is
back
what
on the
we want in
throbbing.
a relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's also something about getting to travel to spaces where you almost get a sense to, like, you can kinda be whoever you want because you do have a lot of times less technology. So, like, being online a lot less. Like, I think for many people, traveling to remote locations and not having their phone for weeks is
Mhm.
such a jarring experience now, but you do get to experience things very differently as a result.
Mhm.
And also, like, if you wanna connect with people, you have to kind of, develop language skills or find ways to connect that is universal, which is really
Mhm.
interesting 'cause, romances happen between foreigners and locals as well, on
Yeah,
these sites, and I think there's something interesting about that of, like, you are going somewhere not just to connect with the past, but, like, with the people around you that is kind of unique to the field of archaeology in a lot of ways.
for sure.
I'm about to advance a thesis on gender and genre in vis-a-vis this adventure archaeology space where
Okay.
like I've mentioned this before, but with like an Indiana Jones and kind of to a lesser extent like Laura Croft, these sort of male centered or sort of male created works. The fantasy is about being super cool already, knowing all this stuff, being able to travel around, knowing the language already, having all the tools, and then like being proven right. That's like a very and like getting a final
Yeah.
comeuppance. That's like kind of the core
Mhm.
fantasy that is like operating in those fields. Whereas with this, with like the romance kind of like Raven, you mentioned like romantasy versus fantasy. Like in this sort of more romantic genre, or even like maybe female authored genre, the fantasy is about transformation. It's about overcoming or shaking off burdens of the pressures, like how she feels put upon in New York, and these various ways, these constrictures on her, these boundaries, and getting to reinvent yourself to sort of like break free in some way, shape, or form. And like that's the sort of operative functioning sort of spine for the story,
Mhm.
which is what you
Yeah.
see here. And to me, that's like kind of the fundamental. It's like already being cool versus like not even necessarily becoming cool, but just like sort of becoming self-actualized or like self-realized in a
Yeah.
way. And like, yeah, like emancipation maybe is the fantasy, and like discovering a new part of yourself that
Yeah,
was there, but maybe not on the
Mhm.
surface.
I like this.
Yeah. That feels very correct in terms of and I mean, I not using patriarchy quite right here, but, like, that's the idea like, ideally for a man is, like, you find yourself at the top of the patriarchy by encompassing all of the things that are idealized with it, and women wanna break away from it because it's
Mhm.
constrictive, as you say, and maybe that's why like, there's that foreign element to it, like, you can't do it in your normal world.
Hmm.
You have to go to a different space in order to do that because it's almost too hard to imagine how you would do it in your own world.
Hmm.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, you need to be taken out of like your comfort zone, right? In order to actually be able to figure out what your limits are and what you're actually capable of doing, because you're always using your current surroundings as a crutch, like, oh, I can't do that because of this, right? There's always an excuse. But when you're in an environment where you literally only have to rely on yourself,
Mhm.
then you really just have to kind of buck up and you really realize like who you are and what you can actually do. And it's very empowering, especially for these female characters that get written this way.
Yeah.
I think that's also why I liked Channing Tatum's character so much in The Lost City is because he also is just he is capable, but not like, and that's why they have Brad Pitt show up
I was about to
as the
say this is the
weatherman's
Brad Pitt
son.
character who
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
is like in an
Yeah.
earlier version, like in an 80s in the Romancing the Stone.
Yeah.
Brad Pitt is the guy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
Versine Channing Tatum is someone who is going to the space and also, like, transforming and learning about not just himself, but his romantic interest at the same time,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
translates so well, and I think at one point I had just made a little clip of when Channing Tatum first shows up at the airport and he sees Brad Pitt and be like, "Oh god, it's you, thank god," and it's like, that's what it feels like when you're the, like, veteran grad student and you have an undergrad coming to a dig for the first time, like, "I found someone I know and who knows what they're doing."
And well, yeah, I do think that Lost City sort of expanded that like growth possibility. Like it doesn't just have to happen for a strong female character. Like growth can happen to anybody, right? And I do think that yeah, Michael Douglas doesn't really grow. Like yeah, he makes one morally good choice. He had the opportunity to make a couple more, but and like he doesn't really change by the end, I feel like he still wants his boat, he still wants the money. That's still like his first and ultimate goal. But in Lost City, yeah, Channing does like kind of have some growth, realizes his own like capabilities and learns new things about the world. And so, yeah, I think it doesn't just have to be the strong female character, right? Like anybody can go on their hero's journey
Mhm.
and get out of their comfort zone and do some growing. And that's why travel is so awesome in itself.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that, even though a majority of the films that dominate archaeology in film, like Indiana Jones, are, like, male protagonist focused, the majority of people going on digs nowadays are women
Hmm.
because they do see that
Hmm.
opportunity to. I would argue it's like I definitely saw it, like, I always wanted to travel with the idea of, like, I get to be something new and different when I do this.
Hmm.
I was going to say, well, this makes me think of like why Laura Croft to me feels so much of like it's kind of a case of like men writing women, right? Where
Yeah.
Laura Croft feels in some ways is like a sort of male envisioned kind of character, but just in the like suit of a woman, or like like in that it as opposed to like this where I feel like you can tell that a woman wrote Joan Welder.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will say too, like, there are other moments that, like, going back to Colin's point of how there are 3 different authors of this movie in some ways, and how their different gendered viewpoints are very present. One of my favorite scenes was at the beginning when she's going out of her apartment to submit her book, and there's the old lady who independently is carrying up her grocery cart up the stairs. She's like, "Mrs. Thomas," or whatever it was. It's like, "Why don't you use the elevator?" And her response is, "Rapists."
And speaking of anxieties in the 80s, because like Colombia, South America was very like a source of American anxiety, but also New York, right, was very
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
in the 70s and 80s as like just this den of crime and misery and, you know, moral sin and all that stuff. Is the cities are these cesspits of
Yeah.
humanity.
Well, and
Mhm.
and there's something about Joan Wilder's character later. So after the bus crash, she is inclined to follow all of the other locals, which would have been the
Mhm.
smart move to do.
Safer.
But Zolo,
Yes.
who, because she doesn't really know Spanish, so Zolo in English is informing her. It's like, "Oh, don't follow them. They're just peasants. They don't know what they're doing." It's like, "No, girl, follow your instincts. You do what the locals do when
Yeah,
things go
100%.
awry." And, it's kind of interesting to see how that can be a scary thing about traveling too, when you can't communicate, when you aren't familiar with an environment, is that you might let your guard down to someone who you can talk with, and they can mislead you, and you don't always trust your instincts of, "Hey, I should probably do what the majority of people who have lived there all their lives are doing in this
Well,
situation. That seems like the right move," but
another thesis I'm about to advance is how culture is weaponized, right? Of how like it's because Zolo speaks English and wears a suit and has these markers of like air quotes like culture, like he is like a man of culture. He speaks multiple languages, all that stuff, and like that's actually where the threat is. I don't have a greater thought beyond that of just like civilization is dangerous.
It is. Well, and like that moment just felt so pronounced because Elijah and I went through something like that the last time we were in
Yeah.
Ganji. I've been to Ganji so many times. I've walked its streets so many times, but we are very obviously American or not local. And we were like, we had been working at the museum that day and we were just waiting for our ride to come pick us up. And some guy was tailing us and like sitting down trying to talk to us. And luckily, it's like I knew the streets well. Like I was local enough, I knew the streets well enough that we were able to lose him just walking the streets quickly because he's trying to be nonchalant about it. But like it's also kind of terrifying. It's like, all right, here we are. We don't know where our ride is. We can't stray too far from that because that's our only way to actually get away from the situation. But if I didn't know that town as well as I did,
Yeah, it would have been weird.
it's like I would have found like the shoe store or like a grocery store or something with another Italian woman and be like, please
We're just gonna sit here and talk for a while.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I liked like that. I think that's why that moment stood out to me because like that was an actual kind of terrifying moment. That is, something you could experience as a woman traveling in a foreign country, wanting the sense of adventure, but like there are very real dangers that can be present. And yeah, so I don't know where else I was going with that thought, but like that moment connected for me in some ways.
Yeah.
It is something to think about as well with, our own cultural biases. And that's kind of really shown in this film when she immediately trusts the one person who can speak English. Just, and you're like, oh yes, someone who, at that point as well, it was, if you don't speak, it was all that, learn English, this and that, especially if you're traveling around. Right. And it was just really interesting to see that like there was no sort of patience with locals that weren't speaking English. And even when Michael Douglas walks into the hotel, right, and he tries to speak Spanish and he's like, oh, thank God you speak English. And you're like, okay, like let's maybe just keep trying in Spanish, or like, don't say it that way. Like you are in someone else's country. Yeah. So that there was that old, I guess that older adage of, or like the way of travel of what it used to be, where everyone just had to assume, or everyone was assuming that you should speak English, and if not, then you really weren't worth talking to.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely as a woman who has traveled alone to some very interesting places and has found herself in some very interesting situations, it is terrifying when you're somewhere, and if you do have to try and hope to find someone who can actually speak to you and actually help you out in those areas, but it's very difficult to figure out who you can trust.
Yeah, I think that was something that this film was doing successfully and that I appreciated because again, this is just kind of more of the culture of archaeologists and like especially female archaeologists and what they have to deal with in the field. That even if there's no archaeology otherwise, like it was still very easy to relate to in that regard. My other favorite scene, because we've talked about the hangar a little bit, but also made me really like Joan Wilder, is when they show up and she's like, "Oh, what's that?" And he's like, "Oh, this is like 5 to 7 years in prison or like lifetime down here." She's like, "Oh, marijuana. What? I went to college."
And also that they throw the brick on the fire with like the plastic wrapping still around
right?
it.
That really bothered
me.
Breathe in deep. It's like get that plastic into your system.
PFAS, BPA.
Yeah, right.
Before they knew what that was, I guess. But like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Terrifying.
I thought it was funny too that like earlier, because she has all her little bottles and she's coping with drinking some alcohol and it's like, drinking? And then he takes the bottle and drinks from it. Like, wait, no, that's probably a good idea.
Yes, let's do that.
Liquid courage for that scene especially.
Yes. All right, y'all, we've hit an hour.
All right. I wanted to, if any has final thoughts, especially Raven, if there's anything that you wanted to say that haven't gotten out there yet.
I don't think so.
The temple door is closing and we got to slide under and grab our hats.
I'm trying to think if there's anything that like we missed. We talked about the maps or on briefly. That was my main thing. Was like, what is like? No one's looked at the map. Suddenly there was like the Devil's Pitchfork, and they're like, "That's on the map." Like, I haven't seen the map. Is it? I don't know.
There's not a lot of puzzle solving, right?
No.
It's just there's one clue,
and there was mother's milk,
Yeah.
and they find
like,
it kind of.
that was weird. The teat.
Yeah, and it's
Like-
like, oh, okay.
So bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most of my questions in this movie are about the heart and like where did it come from and how did it get there? And
Why is it
Yeah.
there?
What is it?
All the archaeologist questions we have.
That's it.
Yeah, what's the
Yeah.
provenance of this thing?
I don't get the bunny thing. Like, whose idea was it to put it in a porcelain rabbit?
Why?
I did
why?
like that they like brought it back to her romance novel. So again, playing into that trope of this is just a real life romance book. And she was like, "Oh, in my first book, I hid the treasure in the statue, but why is it a rabbit?" Just none of it makes any
Yeah.
sense. And then when they're digging and
Makes
they
no
hit it, it
sense.
sounds metal, and then
Yeah.
out pops this like
Mhm.
ceramic
Yeah.
rabbit.
Mhm.
It's so many questions. It was
ridiculous.
so bad, that scene. I was like, they did it really like it was very anticlimactic with getting the stone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Also, just I liked the other moment when they're in the fight and they're like, "Oh, I don't have the stone," and it's in his pants, and you hear ka-tink, and then it just you have the male gaze of the
Slides
stone
it out.
going down his pants. Like you're like,
Yeah.
was that necessary?
No.
Sometimes everybody's watching that. It's like, is that a turd?
And that would still really hurt him. Like, I don't know how he's still
Yeah.
standing. What a cunt.
Right? Yeah. Oh my gosh. No. The crocodiles were incredible and I love them.
Yeah.
And I love how many times he says,
Look at them.
"Look at
snappers.
those snappers."
I love that Zolo gets his arm clean bitten off by. Also, this movie I think was PG, which is wild what they're getting
What?
away with.
Before PG,
I don't think
PG-13
PG-13 might
wasn't-
not have existed
No,
yet.
not till Temple of Doom.
Yeah,
Oh.
That's the
Wow.
reason.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Like
that's
you have literally two naked bodies on top of each other too. Like
yeah.
yeah.
There was a
can
nipple in the
see
first
anything.
scene.
yes,
Like
Yeah.
the like
Yeah.
they zoom right into her wet t-shirt or her wet shirt.
they sure do.
Yep.
But I like that Zolo gets his arm clean bitten off and then takes the time to relight his cigar as he's chasing after her. Which later, attention to detail, that becomes very relevant in the final
True.
scene. But
Mhm. Maybe that's the only way he can figure how he can manage the pain is like he needs that nicotine hit now.
I guess, yeah. This is a final just passing thought and not even mine. So a critic I like pointed this out, but I really like with Danny DeVito's character, when you have characters that drive cars that look like them. Like he's driving a Danny DeVito shaped
That's so
car.
true.
Yes.
Just kind of I want to bring that back. More of that,
Mhm.
please.
Mhm.
Yes. That was good.
We haven't even talked about Juan at all, the drug dealer and romance novel enthusiast.
Just the Deus Ex Machina that like gets them out of the jungle with his giant
Yeah.
Jeep. Yeah.
I just love that he and all his bros like to get together on Saturday and read a book alone. I'm like, we need
Oh,
some
yeah,
more
when is
male
that?
bonding like that. Like,
Yes.
seriously.
Mhm.
I think, Elijah, didn't we, when we were on the dig in Ganjavecchio the first time, didn't we make the guys in our group read,
Yes.
was it 50 Shades?
50
Yeah.
Shades of Grey. It was 50 Shades of Grey. We had them read it out loud. It was the weirdest thing that's ever happened.
In the voice of Gilbert Gottfried, which is still one of my favorite internet videos, 50 Shades of Grey as read by Gilbert Gottfried.
It just goes to show that reading smut really brings people together in some weird way.
Really does.
So true.
I
So
have
true.
made so many friends because of those books.
Yeah.
And it's just
Right?
it's so great. And I can't get enough of them.
I agree.
All right. Does anyone have like a big final question for the group or?
What is the heart?
Maybe it was just the journey or something that was inside of us all
Oh,
along.
the heart
The
was
friends
the,
we made along the
the heart
way.
was the stone it's the stone we romanced along the way.
There you go.
I want to know who he sold it to. Like, where did the stone
Right?
go? Is it in a museum? Do we ever find out the importance of the stone?
No, it's in like Pablo Escobar's compound or something.
And also, arguably, should Zolo have been the bad guy in this because I think he was in charge of antiquities in Colombia.
Yes.
He was also a
And he is
murderer.
trying to. He is a murderer. I don't agree with his methods for sure, but like also it's like that's legitimately what he should be doing is going after.
Yeah, but is he going to like? He's also probably going to just sell it for the money, right?
Also, they burned the map. That would also sell for money.
Not if it's not that
maybe
old,
not.
though.
Maybe it's just
Maybe it's Eduardo's
Yeah.
map. Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
it's just Eduardo's map and not a. I was imagining
Eduardo
a
took the time though
conquistador
to
map.
do full calligraphy, like
Yep.
put it in
Yeah.
a rabbit.
and a
Yeah.
little like you have to fold it over to see the
Oh,
waterfall.
the folding it, and then it ended up being a heart, and I was like, ugh. And it was already pre-folded. It's like she knew, like, oh look, someone's already done it. It was the easiest treasure map of all time.
You could still
So
sell it
dumb.
even as a forgery. I would argue. It's like that. Jack Colton was already in the illicit trade market. He easily could have made some money off the map.
He's
As well.
got
Just saying.
contacts. Yeah.
True.
All right, Lige, do you want to?
All right. Take us out.
Sorry. Hold up.
We're trapped in the digital sphere unless you release us from the spell.
Sheet went away.
I got it in front of me if you want.
If you have it in front of you,
Yeah,
mine is being slow.
That's fine. Special thanks to Raven for joining us today as we find love and adventure in the 80s. Raven, if people want to learn more about you and your work, where can and should they go?
I am on every platform just under @DigItWithRaven. So YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky. Are we still on Twitter? Are we doing Twitter? I'm not Twittering.
We left Twitter.
I think we're not on Twitter.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not
Yeah,
there
we're not
anymore.
on
I'm
Twitter.
there. You won't find anything, but I'm there. So those are all the places. My website as well, digitwithraven.com. All those fun things.
And be sure to check out your book, The Other Ancient Civilizations, Decoding Archaeology's Less Celebrated Cultures.
It's a really fun read and a great intro to archaeology in general, I would also say.
Oh, thanks. Yes, please buy my book.
And finally, special thanks to all you listeners. We could not produce episodes like this without your support. That being said, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe if you like what you hear. You can find all of our episodes at movieswedig.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about our upcoming plans and episode releases, be sure to follow us on social media, where you can find us under the handle of some variation of @movieswedig on most platforms. We'll talk to everybody soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.